Well, welcome everybody to this webinar tonight, and thank you for joining us. So I'm Sandy Hayes, and I'm the lead haemoglobinopathy nurse in Oxford, and we work across the Wessex and Thames Valley region. I'm also the clinical lead for the Clinical Haematology department at University Hospitals, Oxford NHS Foundation Trust. And I'm going to be putting your amazing questions. You've sent in so many brilliant questions to Dr. Noémi Roy, who's one of our consultant haematologists and in Oxford, and also is an honorary lecturer, senior lecturer at Oxford University. So again, a big thank you for the questions you've already sent in. If you want to ask a question during the event, please post it on the Q&A box. It's a little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer it. Please, can you make sure your camera and microphone are turned off, and these buttons are also at the bottom of your screen. To change how the speakers appear, click the three buttons at the bottom of the screen next to the red icon. They're running up in a little bar, and then you can change the layout and then select the sidebar and spotlight setting. It's that sidebar or spotlight. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer any questions about individual cases tonight. But please, if you do have a question about your care or anything that we talk about tonight, then please take them back to your clinical team that usually looks after you, and they will be, I'm sure, very happy to help you. So tonight is being recorded, and you'll be sent a copy of the recording. This event's been organised by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, or the NIHR for short. The NIHR is a government-funded body that funds research in the NHS, public health and social care. If you're interested in learning more about research and to search for studies that you can take part in, please visit the Be Part of Research website. And you can just search for that, Be Part of Research. And remember, you can take part in many studies even if you don't have a health condition yourself. So I'm going to move over now to the very exciting list of questions that you've all sent in tonight. So, Dr. Roy, I'm going to call you Noémi because I'm going to get really confused if I start calling you Dr. Roy. We've worked together for a very long time, so excuse me, everybody. So, Noémi, your first question is, how can patients get involved in trial research?
So that's a great question because we're really keen that a lot of people do get involved. Obviously, it depends what condition you have. And as Sandy said, in fact, there's so much research going on in the UK that even if you yourself don't have a clinical condition, you can get involved in all sorts of research for individuals that are actually healthy. But let's assume we're talking about people with sickle cell disease, sickle cell disorder. The way to get involved in research is usually the best way is to go through your own clinical team. So asking your consultants who look after you if there's a study you can be involved in, and if they don't know, they will find a way. They have a way to find out. So that's the best thing to do. I've got a few slides that I wanted to that we can use also. I just shared this one for now because it's the Sickle Cell Society. So Sickle Cell Society is a charity that helps people with sickle cell disorder, and they've got a page. Let me just put that as a slide you can see. So if you search for the Sickle Cell Society, one of their pages on information and support is clinical trials open in the UK. So you can go onto there and you can find out what trials would be applicable to you. So that's the two main ways.
Excellent, thank you very much. So the next question is, what in your experience matters most to people living with sickle cell disease?
I'm really pleased that somebody asked this question, actually. When I saw the list of questions, I thought, wow, this is the question that if I was being asked to choose one, this is the one I would go for. And again, I'm going to share a slide because we have actually done something called a prioritization workshop. So what does this mean? It means that we've asked people who live with sickle cell to choose what they think they would like research to happen on. Because we've only got 45 minutes for the whole talk today, for the whole conversation, I'm not going to go into the details of how we did this, but I can tell you this was done in 2019, and there were about 30 patients who participated in this. And it was a workshop where we kind of whittled down what people were thinking and what was most important to them. And so this is the list of the top 10. Number 1 was, how can we find a universally available cure for sickle cell disease? And obviously that is close to everybody's heart. All of us would like to find a cure. And the reason that the patients chose a universally available cure is because they didn't want it to be something that's so expensive that only people from very rich countries like the UK would have access to, especially because most people living with sickle cell disease actually live in Africa or in India or countries with poor resources. But look at what came up number 2. How can we improve quality of life for people living with sickle cell disease? So this is great that this is so important to people living with sickle cell, and we definitely want to do more research about improving quality of life. There was a question about the implications of sickle cell for work and education. How can we manage acute pain and prevent people coming into hospital? Oops, can you still see my screen? I've done something funny to it.
That's okay.
I'll just go to the next one. Oh, I don't know why that slide's not going to the next one. But essentially, I'll take that off. For some reason, it's not going through. The next questions was about lack of diversity in the carers and the fact that there's racism, discrimination, and stigma, and how that affects people living with sickle cell. There was a question about harnessing the political agendas to improve care for sickle cell disease, optimizing pregnancy for mother and baby in sickle cell. A lot of people were interested in complementary therapies and whether they could help in sickle cell disease, and they wanted to include CBD oil and cannabis in that. Number 9 was, how do we manage chronic pain? And number 10 was, how can a comprehensive care team impact the outcomes of people living with sickle cell? So that means, if we work together better, does that improve how people's health do in the long term? So that's obviously just one list, but if we replicate this across the country, I suspect most people would agree with this question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Right. So the next question is, now this is a really important question. Why is sickle cell lagging behind other inherited chronic conditions in terms of research and innovation? Why has the condition not been invested in? Issues seem systematic. How do we go about addressing these? Really, really, really important, isn't it?
So, Sandy, you're right. That's a really important question, and the answer is not very easy. So, for example, for those of you who don't know how to compare this to other conditions, because sickle cell disease is a inherited condition and it's recessive, that means you need one copy of the abnormal gene from each parent. If we look at another condition like that, that's similar in terms of how many people it affects, a good example will be cystic fibrosis. Okay, so cystic fibrosis is also a rare condition that's recessive, and it's pretty comparable to sickle cell, okay, in terms of numbers, although there probably are more people with sickle cell than with cystic fibrosis. And cystic fibrosis receives 10 times more funding for research than sickle cell disease. So you've got to ask yourself the question, it's not because sickle cell is rare that it's not receiving enough funding and enough attention. What is the other reason? And a lot of people think, and I completely agree with this, that actually it's things related to racism and to the fact that the whole society has not been able and not been fair in valuing sickle cell disease as much as other similar conditions. And I'm not saying this, just to be controversial. A lot of people are saying this. There's a lot of papers that you can read of people's opinions, and if you've seen the APPG report, the All-Party Parliamentary Group report called No One is Listening, this talks about how sickle cell care in the UK is substandard. And I don't mean substandard compared to how we would ideally like the care to be. I mean, when you have a sickle cell patient coming into A&E, their care is not as good as somebody else who comes in with something different that requires just as much painkillers, for example. So society's ills, racism, discrimination, stigma, all of those things are playing a part. Are there other reasons? Possibly. One thing that we may come back to later, Sandy, is how difficult it is to recruit people with sickle disease into different studies. And so I've got some examples of some studies that have had to be stopped early because there were not enough people that were joining, okay? But then we're a bit in a chicken and egg situation here. So if we're saying there's not enough research in sickle cell, but also sickle cell patients don't tend to join research studies, but then there's been discrimination as far that goes, being perpetuated against this community, then maybe it's understandable that people, they want research, but they are reluctant to take part in it. So it's a very, very complex issues, which all of us working in sickle cell want to address, and we are here to try and reverse that. Whether we can do anything to increase the amount of funding, that's a lot more complicated. But if there are people who want to be involved in research, there are lots of research studies for sickle cell, and we are very, very keen to get as many people enrolled as possible so that we can answer some of these really important research questions.
So the next question is, what advancements have been made in terms of gene therapy for treating sickle cell disease in the UK, and how can a child be part of this research? If anyone's listening is having any problems with the chat, if you see the email that was sent with the details, if you have a question, just please respond to that email, and we'll make sure that's relayed.
Okay, so gene therapy, that's a super good question. And I do have another slide I wanted to share, because I think we need to be a little bit clear about what do we mean by gene therapy, because and I'm not, this is not because you are all members of the public. It's even doctors, medical students, our own staff get a bit confused about what exactly is gene therapy and what's gene editing. And the reason for this is because there's been so many changes and new things. So it's really great that there's a lot more of this that around than used to be. So if you can see my screen now, there are every time I touch this it stops working, sorry. I'll have to stop presenting. Okay, so there's something called gene therapy, and there's something called gene editing, and then there's something called bone marrow transplant. So on this picture you can see at the bottom right, the one that's called D, it's the easiest, the one I think is easiest to understand. It's where we give a completely new gene, we package it up in a virus, an unharmful virus, and we send it in to the HSC, which is the hematopoietic stem cell. So this cell in the middle, HSC, is a cell that is able to become a red blood cell, a white blood cell, and a platelet. Essentially, it's the cells that make up your bone marrow. So gene therapy, we send in these new genes, and so that the person can stop making the sickle hemoglobin, and instead they make normal adult hemoglobin. Then the more complex ones at the top, A and B, that's where you go in and you actually use little tools. Instead of sending in the gene, you send in the tools to repair the genome. So you repair and you turn the sickle back into a normal hemoglobin, or instead of turning it into normal hemoglobin, a lot easier than that is turning it into hemoglobin F, fetal hemoglobin. Now, a lot of you, if you've got sickle cell, you will have heard of people taking hydroxycarbamide to increase the fetal hemoglobin levels. So this gene editing is where we send in the tools to turn on the fetal hemoglobin. Now, while this is great, it's not possible to do this in a person who's just sitting there, okay? In order to target these cells, we have to take the person's own bone marrow cells out, these HSC cells, and we have to send in those little tools or that gene in the lab. And then once those cells are ready, we have to send them back into the bone marrow. And that might sound really easy because actually they're liquid. So you could give it, it's like giving a blood transfusion. You have a needle put in and the cells come back in, okay? So that's kind of the easy part. The problem is that for these cells to grow inside the patient's bone marrow, we have to make space, okay? And to make space for those cells to grow, we have to get rid of the cells that are already there. It's a little bit like if you wanted to plant some seeds, you would want to plant those seeds in soil. You don't want to plant the seeds where there's lots of grass growing, because if you throw the seeds where the grass is growing, they won't stand a chance to grow because that big grass is already there. So we have to get rid of the grass. So you've got blank soil and plant your seeds, and then they can grow. Okay. And how do we get rid of the grass? How do we clear out the space? Unfortunately, it's with chemotherapy. And this is where the big problem is with gene editing and gene therapy, that it requires the patient to undergo chemotherapy. Now, we do give chemotherapy to lots of different people who are having all sorts of different bone marrow transplants, but it's very different if you've got cancer already and we end up giving you some gene therapy. If you've got a condition that's not cancer, like sickle cell, then giving somebody chemotherapy and all the side effects that that has, both in terms of mortality and in terms of risks down the line as the chemotherapy side effects kind of accumulate as people get older, that's where things are a lot more tricky. So I hope I've explained where we're at, which is that we've got these technologies. In terms of what people want to know about how you can get involved, can you see this? This is an article actually from the New Scientist in June about...
It's not popping up, Noémi.
Oh, it's not. Okay, I'll stop sharing and start again. So
yeah.
So this one is an article from the New Scientist about gene therapy in the UK. And can you see it now? It says children to get CRISPR treatment for sickle cell disease in trial. And in this article, they talk about how actually we've been doing this in people over the age of 12, but now there's a trial opening in London for people who are younger than 12. I think it's 2 to 12. And I've checked with the person who's running the trial, which is Dr. Josu de la Fuente. He says it should be opening in August. Again, get in touch, ask your clinical team if you want to, if you've got a child and you want them to be considered for this. And Dr. de la Fuente is absolutely wonderful, and he will spend the time to explain the risks, the benefits, and what the treatment is like.
So we've got a question related to what you've just been saying. What are the side effects of having gene therapy?
Yeah.
So you've already talked about the side effects of having very, very strong chemotherapy. What other side effects do we know about at the moment?
So the side effects the main side effect that we're worried about is, so there's lots of side effects to chemotherapy, like losing your hair and being more prone to infections and things like that. The things we're worried about are things in the long term. And what I mean by that is the risk of cancer in the long term. So for example, the gene therapy trials, they've been going on for nearly 10 years, about 7 years. And there were presentations this year to show that there were 2 cases. This is of these trials. This is the one where I say they send in the whole gene. 2 cases that developed leukemia, acute leukemia. And it's not thought to be due to the tools themselves being sent in, but it's thought to be due to the whole complex issue around the chemotherapy. Now, people will want to know, will gene editing also have that side effect? And the answer is, we don't know until we follow people up for longer and longer. But there are good reasons to think why that risk is lower for gene therapy than for genome editing than for gene therapy. And then there's an even newer technique that no one's tried in people yet, that's been tried only in the lab, which is called base editing, where you send in it's a much gentler tool that doesn't go around cutting DNA and causing damage. So everything keeps getting better. And I've always said this, and I'm not the only one to say it, I've heard other people say it too, that the patients who volunteered to have these very new therapies, they are as much pioneers of this science as the clever doctors who thought of it. Because for somebody to take those risks and say, I'll have it done, they are providing a wonderful, they are wonderful pioneers for the whole patient group. And I think they should be recognized as such.
Thank you. Someone keeps muting me, but there we go. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer on a really complex topic. And we've got two questions here, one that was sent in earlier and one that actually is linked to it. So I'll pull them both out at the same time. So the first part of the question is, are Black patients routinely screened for sickle cell anemia? And then the next question is, how does one know they have sickle cell anemia and where can one go to find out? So they're perfectly linked questions.
Fantastic, thank you. So yes, absolutely. When people say, are Black people routinely screened for sickle cell disease, the answer is actually everybody, irrespective of your color, is screened for sickle cell disease. So we've got two screening programs in the UK. One is the antenatal screening, where pregnant ladies get screened to see whether they might be carriers of sickle cell or another condition called thalassemia. And then if they are, then their partners would get tested to see if the baby is at risk. And then if the baby's at risk, then they get given the option, do they want to find out if their baby is affected? And if the baby's affected, then they have the option. Some people choose to terminate the pregnancy. Some people say they'll carry the pregnancy. So that's the antenatal screening. And then the neonatal screening screens every baby. So you probably all know that when babies are born, they get this little heel prick, a little tiny little needle in the heel, and then a drop of blood goes on pieces of paper, this filter paper, and that gets sent around the country to screen for all sorts of conditions. And there are conditions where if you know about the baby having it very early, you can prevent long-term damage, okay? And sickle cell is one of these conditions where you can prevent long-term damage by giving babies penicillin from the age of 3 months. And I'm not going to go into details here because this is more about research and about clinical, but the answer is yes, everybody's being screened. Of course, if you weren't born in this country, then you weren't screened, or you may not have been screened. And really, you can go to the GP to have this test. And GPs absolutely have to do it if you ask for it. And the other thing is, what we're finding is with a lot of young people who've got sickle cell, a lot of them don't really want to wait until they're pregnant to find out that what's happening with the father. So, or if you're a man, then what's happening with the mother. So a lot of young people with sickle cell decide that actually they quite like their partner to have the test a lot earlier, like maybe very early in the relationship before they get too attached, in case that's going to make a decision, make an impact to them about whether they carry on with that relationship. So we're seeing a lot more people asking for this test. So please don't hesitate to ask your GP. Just to bring it back to research a little bit, one of the questions that people are working on in terms of research is, can we make this diagnosis in the baby without having a chance of hurting the baby? So if you want to test the DNA of the baby, usually you have to go in with a needle and take a sample, not of the baby itself, but of some of the fluid or the cells around the baby. And that carries a risk of miscarriage. And so there's some people working on some research studies to see if they can capture from the mother's blood a tiny bit of the baby's DNA, because apparently there's some communication between the mother and the baby's circulation. And actually we will be able to work it out. And in future, we won't have to do these procedures that have a risk of miscarriage. So that's some research that's happening in this area.
Thanks, Noémi. I think I wonder if it might be worth just addressing the question around Black people being screened, because as you alluded to, actually not all of our patients are have African origins. So maybe just a quick word about that, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah. So it's absolutely true that people that come from that have African origin or Indian or the Southeast Asian, they're more sickle cell, and that's because if you're a sickle cell carrier, there is a reduced chance of getting severe malaria. Now, I'm always very careful when I say this, because as an individual, it doesn't mean you're protected personally, okay? So, but it's as a group. Statistically, people who are carriers of sickle cell trait as a group are less likely to get severe malaria. And that's what caused the gene to survive, and the reason why the gene is so common in some of these populations. So really, when we're looking at who are the populations that are more likely to have sickle cell, it is that sort of area around the equator where malaria was or is. And so that's, but the Greek people, Italians, and also you just need to have one mix in your past with somebody of African origin, and your skin color might be very pale, but you still have the gene. So we just can't make assumptions. And I know when I talked about stigma and racism, which comes in a lot when we're talking about people receiving their pain medication when they come in with sickle cell pains in a crisis in A&E, we've also heard of people who get told you can't have sickle cell. You're asking for morphine, but you can't have sickle cell because you're white. So you can't have, so it can't be sickle cell, so you must be lying. So the sort of stigma goes both ways with this condition in terms of skin color.
Thank you. I'm really aware that we're already half an hour into our session tonight. So the next question is, what research is being done into managing symptoms such as pain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the short answer is not a lot. The long answer is more complicated. So sickle cell pain, some people with sickle cell don't experience too much pain, and that's not the main thing they have. But for some others, it's actually a very big part of their condition. And there is actually in the UK something called the National Pain Group, which was put together not that long ago. And they are looking very much at what kind of new trials might there be, because everybody seems to have forgotten about pain in terms of there's lots of studies to how can we reduce the painful crises, but there's no studies about once you've got a painful crisis, what's the best treatment. Now, part of the reason why there's not a lot of research on this is, you'll remember at the beginning, I said that some studies haven't recruited very well. And there's a specific study where they were giving, this is based in the UK, they were giving very high doses of ibuprofen with a PCA. So that's the morphine that goes into the vein where the patient has control when they want to give it. And they were giving this specific regime of very high doses of ibuprofen alongside it, and they were trying to see whether, if you kind of go in sharp shock with this ibuprofen, could you then reduce the amount of morphine that people are getting? Because obviously we all know that the more morphine you get, then the more likely your body gets used to it. So you need higher and higher doses for it to work. And actually, they had to publish the fact that the study had to stop because they couldn't recruit enough people. Now, it's not as simple as people saying, well, I'm very suspicious, I don't want to be part of the study, because that can explain some of the difficulties. But it was more complex than that. It was to do with the fact that each hospital had their own policy. Each hospital had their own organization. Some hospitals couldn't do the PCAs, or couldn't do them at particular times of night or the weekend, or couldn't do them on particular wards. So the study became so complex, and so few people, I think they had something like over 200 people were approached, and they had 7 people out of those 200 that were randomized to this actual intervention, the high dose of ibuprofen. So there's 2 things going on. I hope I'm clear that yes, there is a lack of attention being paid to pain, although hopefully this National Pain Group will try and resolve some of that, and there are some patient representatives on that pain group. But also, when it's been tried before, it's been almost insurmountable, and they put in a lot of energy and a lot of funding and all of that, and then the study didn't give any answer because not enough people could be randomized.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is about research in primary care. So what research is being done to support care from non-specialist clinicians, for example, GPs?
I'm afraid the answer is very short. I think it's nothing. So it's a good question because it kind of raises the point about if we're thinking about improving care for people living with sickle cell, should we be trying to change what's happening in primary care? So as with a lot of rare conditions, there tends to be two sort of categories of GPs. You've got the odd one that get very interested and get really involved and really want to learn about the condition and really get in, actually help manage the patient. And then you've got the vast majority of GPs that say, I don't know anything about this, it's a bit scary. They don't say it quite that clearly, but this is the specialist. This requires specialist care. But actually, we probably could massively improve the care of people with sickle cell if people had access to their GP. For example, if you were having more crises and you could go to your GP, be assessed, and it turns out that you've got a bit of a chest infection, and then you could start antibiotics, you wouldn't even have to go anywhere near the hospital. So you could sort of imagine. Sorry, this is my computer making a noise. You could sort of imagine a situation where you could design a research study where you randomize people, because I'm using this word randomize without explaining it. With research, you always have to be sure that the fact you're studying something doesn't change it because you're studying it. Okay, so we always want to have a control group. So we want to compare an intervention, what we're doing, with the control group. And the control group generally is people having standard care, what we normally do already. And then the intervention will be the extra thing we're doing, whether that is giving this high dose of ibuprofen for pain or whether that is involving the GPs. Each of those is an intervention. And then you have to randomize people, because if you don't randomize people and you say, let's say I'm the person who's doing this study, I might subconsciously send all the patients who are more severe to the group where having standard care, and the patients who are less severe to the group having the intervention. And then the intervention would look like it's working really well, but that's because that group would be full of people whose sickle cell is less severe. So you have to have a method of making it random so that when a patient enters the study, a machine or a computer or whatever says you go to this group or you go to that group. And then after you finish your intervention, you compare your two groups and say, did it make a difference to the intervention? So you could imagine designing a research study where people are randomized to standard of care or intervention with the GP. And that might include specific education sessions with the GP. It might include, I don't know, like let's say a hotline that the GP can speak to the hematologist. You could come up with something. And then you could say at the end of a year, did the patients who had the extra care from the GP, were they in hospital less often than the patients who had standard of care, or did they have fewer crises, or were they more happy? So yeah, we could do research in this. Nobody's really done it. If we could get the funding for it, I think there would be some enthusiasm.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to combine another couple of questions here. So what ongoing research is there for both preventative and long-term therapies? And then there's also a question around use of hydroxycarbamide in sickle cell management, prophylactic treatment management for sickle cell anemia. So, sitting in the clinic, I would say they were both linked, but we'll listen to your expert view.
So I'm going to start with the hydroxycarbamide one, because this is an area where we have a lot of data. We've got 30 years worth of many research studies of patients with sickle cell in the UK, in Europe, in North America, in Africa, in India. Wherever hydroxycarbamide is used, it has wonderful preventative effects. And so the benefits of hydroxyurea or hydroxycarbamide are a reduction in pain, an improvement in fatigue, and improvement in long-term outcomes. People on hydroxyurea live longer than people not on hydroxyurea. Now, I always have to qualify that statement, and I always compare it to smoking. So we all know that smoking causes lung cancer, but we will all know somebody who has smoked all their life and never got lung cancer and dies at 100. And we will all know people who died of lung cancer at 50 and never smoked a cigarette in their life. It's the same thing with hydroxycarbamide. Patients who take hydroxycarbamide is not a promise that they're going to live to 100. and patients who don't take hydroxycarbamide, it's not a promise that they're going to die young, okay? But we know statistically that the higher the dose of hydroxycarbamide you can take, the better your outcomes are in the long term. So, but what about what's happening? The question is, what further research is being done? And so, for example, it's important that all current and future research doesn't compare to nothing, okay? Because hydroxyurea is so powerful. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, and some people are on hydroxyurea and still have pain and still have fatigue and still run into problems, okay? But generally, it does improve things. And so if we have new studies, we must compare them to, at the very least, people being on hydroxyurea. And some of the new drugs that are coming through, the wonderful thing is that in the studies, they do actually let you take hydroxyurea as well as these new drugs. So just off the top of my head, there are lots of new drugs that are coming along where there are trials. So for example, in Oxford, we've got a study open called Hibiscus. And I'm not going to say the name of the drug because it's very difficult to say, but basically it's a medication it's a tablet, and it was kind of designed for people with a different inherited anemia called pyruvate kinase deficiency. It makes an enzyme in the red blood cells more, it's not cresonlizumab nuridine, it's something, no, it's not, it's etavopivat is the name. So this drug, it stabilizes the enzymes in the red blood cell. And so the way that it's thought to work and the way that it looks like it's working is by stabilizing the enzymes in the red cell. Even though you've still got sickle, the cells are less likely to get destroyed. And the longer the cells live, the less they get destroyed, the better the outcomes in the long term. So, for example, that is a drug that is being tested in Oxford at the moment. But there are other drugs. And what I'm finding really interesting is that there's drugs that were not designed for sickle cell that are being tried for sickle cell patients and that seem to have a benefit. So, for example, there's a drug called L-glutamine, which is an amino acid. Like, some people buy it in Holland and Barrett. I don't know if people are doing like weightlifting or things like that to build up their muscles. You can buy it like that. And actually, this study showed that it improves the lifespan of the red blood cells. I don't have time to explain how, but and so we have a little bit of access to it in the UK, not very easy access, but it is possible. Somebody's mentioned cresonlizumab. So this is the drug a lot of you will have heard about. That's like the only new drug we've had in the last 20 years. The way this works is it's an injection that goes in the veins, and it's given once a month, and it's to prevent the red blood cells from sticking. So it's a bit like there's Velcro between blood cells and the lining of the blood vessels, and this cresonlizumab prevents the Velcro from working. So but there's only been one trial on it. The trial was convincing, but people who are starting cresonlizumab we have to collect the data to see, we can add that data to the trial data to see how effective it is. But we only know it's effective in reducing the number of painful crises. We don't have information about the long-term outcome and the preventative side of things.
Thank you. I think we might need to make the point that L-glutamine, you need to take it in industrial size doses as part of the trial. It's not just the routine dose that you buy over the counter. So if you're interested in L-glutamine, then please speak to your haematology team. So Dr. Well, we've got 3 minutes left. So let me just have a quick look down here to see if there's a question that's kind of going to cover. You've touched on...
While you're looking, Sandy, I'll just say that we also do a quality of life study called RUDY, which is open in a lot of hospitals in the UK to answer that question about how we can improve quality of life.
Okay. Our moderation tonight is saying we can go on to 8 p.m. if we wish. So we've got a lot of questions that might fit that bill. So a question from the chat. So how do we get people to care more about sickle cell? This is going back to the issue of actually, why aren't there many studies? Why isn't there much funding? So the research is needed, but research requires funding. How do we get sickle cell higher up the healthcare agenda, especially given its prevalence?
I completely agree. And I mean, I think if I had the answer to that, I'd be doing that thing. I think we all do a little bit of it. So, we do a lot of advocating for further funding. it's about putting in these research applications. So obviously you can imagine that if you're a funding body, whether it's the NIHR that's government funded or whether it's the Wellcome Trust or whatever, you're receiving lots and lots of applications from lots and lots of different researchers or research teams, each of whom is passionate about the condition that they look after, and each of whom will write, very convincing grant proposals that that this condition really needs the money. And it's very difficult, especially in this day and age when there's shortage of money in everything. I do think, some of it is to do with trying to work with social media, trying to change people's attitudes, not just about the funding. For example, if people want to do some fundraising and try and increase the sort of visibility of sickle cell disease. But I think I saw something from Marsha earlier in the chat saying for her birthday, she had, here we go. For my birthday in June, I decided to do a fundraiser for Sickle Cell Society on Facebook. Despite tagging most of my friends, only one person contributed. It breaks my heart, Marsha. And this is what we see repeatedly. I don't know what we can do about it. I think sharing stories, that's one thing we've talked about. So talking to other people about this condition, and it's very difficult. I understand if people have a condition, they want to live as good a life as possible, and you don't want to spend your life kind of saying things to other people about how difficult your life is, and you just want to get on with it. But yes,
I do think there's probably I think there's probably something really important that we could learn from the breast cancer groups. I think they were very, very, very vocal as patient groups in the 80s and 90s and 2000s to remove postcode lottery that existed for treatment of breast cancer. And I think that there's definitely something to be learnt from that campaign. Okay, so moving on to the next question. What is the criteria used to define what sickle cell patients can be accepted for being on the various new treatments for sickle?
Yeah, so I've talked about crizanlizumab, which is the drug that's the infusion that goes in the vein every month that sort of stops that Velcro. And then there's another new drug. So I've talked about L-glutamine, which is the amino acid, which requires, if you want to have that, you have to ask your clinician to basically fill out a form and ask the commissioners, which is the people who decide where the money goes, whether you can go on it. And they kind of argue your case and explain why you need it. The crizanlizumab is available. So there's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence has approved it, and it's taken a while, but we've now each hospital kind of knows what they're doing in terms of how to give it and how to assess patients for it. So essentially, patients need to have something like 2 crises that brought them to hospital or brought them into contact with healthcare professionals in the last year. You can't be on blood transfusions. So if you're already on regular blood transfusions, you can't have crizanlizumab. But if you're on hydroxyurea, you can have crizanlizumab. And then it needs to be discussed at the local MDT, which is a multidisciplinary team meeting, and then people then the clinicians can prescribe it. It can usually be given in most people's local hospital. Kind of depends on how advanced your local hospital is, but a lot of hospitals are able to give it. So that's the crizanlizumab. Voxelotor, which is the other drug that is new, has not been approved by NICE, but in the meantime, the drug company is paying for it while they wait for NICE to decide. It's a bit of a complex situation, but that one, the way that one works, it's a tablet, and it's a little bit odd because what it does is it kind of sticks the oxygen onto the sickle hemoglobin. So it kind of, if you've got the sickle hemoglobin and oxygen comes along, it makes it more sticky. I think of it a bit like a magnet. It's like it makes the magnet stronger. So the good news is that because the magnet is stronger, the cell is less likely to sickle because the cells tend to sickle when there's not enough oxygen. However, when that red blood cell goes to your muscles and your muscles want that oxygen, that magnet is stronger. So you'd think that maybe less oxygen would get to the muscles. So it's a little bit of counterintuitive drug. So that one you can have while you're on transfusions. And I believe while the drug company is paying for it, it doesn't matter how many crises you've had in the last year. However, because it can raise the total hemoglobin, only people who are fairly anemic can have it. Otherwise, there's a risk of their blood becoming too thick. But the bottom line is, please speak to your clinical teams. Every single clinical team in England knows about these drugs and knows what they're supposed to do in terms of getting access to it. Now, of course, some people might not be eligible. So, for example, crizanlizumab, we can't give it to people whose kidneys don't work or don't work properly. However, there's a clinical trial specifically for people whose kidneys don't work properly. So it's not because you don't fit the criteria that it means you can't have it. You might still be offered it as part of a clinical trial.
Thank you. So I think you touched on it, but maybe it might be worth speaking about the criteria for people to have a bone marrow transplant or gene therapy, and how that's organised and arranged.
Yeah. In fact, I might just share another slide, if that's okay. Here we go. So hopefully you all know this, and if you don't, then I'm sorry, and please tell me who looks after you so I can tell them that they should have told you this. But the whole of the, in England, the whole care of people living with sickle cell, thalassemia, and all these inherited anemias has been reorganized. And so we're organized in these HCCs, which is a hemoglobinopathy coordinating center, and SHTs, which are specialty hemoglobinopathy teams, and then local providers. So for example, let's take Oxford as an example. Oxford is a specialty hemoglobinopathy team, and we look after 5 different local providers. So those are our district general hospitals, but also Oxford is an HCC. So we look after the Southampton SHT that looks after all of their local hospitals. And the reason for organizing all this is that the real specialists who have a particular interest in these conditions, they're few and far between. And because there's none of them generally in these gray areas, and there's a few in the pink, and then there's more in the dark pink, by having this reorganized structure, we can make sure that the people who really spend all their time thinking and reading and learning all about these conditions can feed back all of the important information, like, the care pathways, how to look after people, what's important, what do we need to make sure we're doing right, all of those things. And then if they run out of ideas and they get stuck for how to look after a really complex patient, there's something higher up called the National Hemoglobinopathy Panel, where there's a monthly MDT, which is a clinical discussion, and these cases get presented. Now, the reason I'm showing you this now is because specifically if you are an adult wanting to be considered for a bone marrow transplant, then your case would have to be discussed at the national level to make sure that you fit the criteria. Now, the thing that's difficult and a little bit heartbreaking about sickle cell disease is transplants. We know they're curative, okay? We know they can cure people of their sickle cell, but of course, if you're having somebody else's bone marrow put inside you, not only are you being given chemotherapy that has all those side effects and long-term complications we've talked about earlier, but also there is a risk of mortality from being given somebody else's transplant, somebody else's bone marrow, and there's also a risk of this horrible thing called graft versus host disease. Because of all of those, we have to be sure that somebody's condition is severe enough to warrant taking those risks. Now, with a condition like beta thalassemia major, we can tell from birth when somebody's born with this condition, we know that they're going to be transfusion dependent their whole life. And so we know the severity. But with sickle cell, there'll be plenty of people who've got hemoglobin SS who actually have a very mild form. And there'll be other people who have a very severe form. And we haven't, at this point in time, got the knowledge to distinguish between those two. And if talking about different research studies, there is an NIHR bio-resource study where people are sending in their samples because we want to compare, we want to look at the genetic material of 30,000 different sickle patients all over the world, pick out those tiny little differences in their genetics to sort of work out if we can tell when somebody is going to have severe sickle cell versus not severe sickle cell. So the heartbreaking thing is that you have to wait and find out if somebody's got severe sickle cell. So you have to wait until they have a really severe complication, like a stroke or, you know, some horrible thing happened to them. And then you say, oh, okay, this patient has severe sickle cell, therefore they're eligible for the transplant. Now, this is mostly what used to happen in childhood. Now transplant is available for adults, and generally the types of people who are being considered for transplant are people in whom nothing else has worked. They've had hydroxyurea, it hasn't worked. They've had blood transfusions, it hasn't worked, or they've got so many antibodies it's almost impossible to transfuse them. So transplant is almost only reserved for people with, you know, really problematic condition, problematic sickle cell disease. In terms of gene therapy, at the moment, gene therapy is not available in the UK except through trials. And so for that, it's slightly, you do need to have a severe form of sickle cell, but also your body needs to be healthy enough. Like you can't, your kidneys have to work, your heart has to work well, because of the side effects of the treatment, that they want to make sure that people are as fit a state as possible before they go for this very high-tech treatment.
Okay, thank you. So we're heading into the last 5 minutes now, and we'll see how far we can get through the rest of these questions. So the next question is, what's the best management or intervention for chronic fatigue in people living with sickle cell anemia? And my question would be, again, is there any research going on about that?
So yes, not as much as I'd like. The first thing I would say is we've spoken a little bit to a few sickle cell patients who've said, actually, I don't bother mentioning fatigue anymore to my doctor because they can never do anything, and so they never listen, or I've stopped bothering. So the first thing I would say to people is, please do keep talking about fatigue, because this is really important. In terms of interventions, so we have seen some wonderful responses to hydroxyurea in terms of fatigue. We've got patients who have really, it's changed their life in terms of how much they're able to do. Now, a lot of people living with sickle cell are very conscientious and really focus on their work, but then they get home and then they don't do anything at home because they're so tired from having been at work all day. And we've had a lot of people say suddenly they're able to do more, they're able to go out in the evenings, they're able to pick up some activities, some hobbies, etc. So hydroxycarbamide absolutely can have a really important improvement in people's fatigue. There is a study open right now, which I can send out when we send out the recording. It's for children and young people. The Sickle Cell Society have it on their website, and it's some interventions specifically to deal with fatigue in children and young people with sickle cell. Otherwise, the Rudy study is looking at fatigue, and this is not an intervention. This is about measuring fatigue. And what was I going to say? Oh, yes, we've got a little project. It's not quite a research study, but a little project with our physiotherapists to see if we can improve people's fatigue.
There's a quick question about use of hydroxycarbamide in CDA.
Yeah, it might.
Oh, CDA, sorry, CDA type 1.
Yeah, I'll just answer in the text.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question about crizolizumab, but I think you've talked quite a lot about crizolizumab earlier on. There's a question here from a PhD student with a background in chemistry. How can they get involved in sickle cell research? Give us a call.
That is a great not question, but yeah, basically we would love, just get in touch with me. I can put basically there's lots of different aspects of sickle cell, and and sickle cell research, and there's a research group. I mean, there's basically like lots of different clinicians that kind of coordinate research. Now everybody's doing, lots of different people are doing different bits of research all over the country, but I can put you in touch with a group that would then be able to steer you in the right direction.
Great. And then probably just about our last question. Sorry, I'll just have a look back up here. So what is the Commission doing to take advantage of political will to invest in sickle cell research to really improve the quality of people's lived experience?
Yeah, so I think we've gone round full circle here, because we're back at the question about why there hasn't been much research in sickle cell. But I think for people to really, I mean, the more noise I think, Sandy, you're right to talk about breast cancer and the noise people have made. Maybe it's a question of everybody writing to their MPs and, I don't know, writing. I mean, for example, I think there are different, the Sickle Cell Society, the more people talk about it and say this is important, we need more funding, and maybe it's a question of saying, do the funding bodies need to be asked to what's the word I'm looking for, ring fence some money for sickle cell? I don't know, but the more people make noise, the more chance I think we have of making progress.
Absolutely, and I think the question is also about the specialist teams. What are we doing as specialist teams about raising the profile?
Yeah, so in terms of raising the profile, I mean, all of us will be involved in the national panel and be involved in sort of the CRG, which is the clinical reference group. So I think the specialist teams are very heavily invested in this, and as I said, are strong advocates for the patients. But if we can add more of the patient voices, that would carry more weight, I think.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. I'm sorry we haven't got to everybody's questions tonight, but I'm hoping you've had a really good flavour and a good overview of what's happening in sickle cell research in the UK. I just wanted to thank Noémi for her time, and thank you all for providing such amazing questions. They've been really interesting. And I hope you found it insightful and an informative session. We want to thank also our host, the National Institute for Health and Care Research. And if you want to learn more about research and how you can take part in studies, even if you're healthy, don't forget the Be Part of Research website. You'll be sent a recording of tonight's event as well as an evaluation form. So we'd be really grateful if you could take some time to complete that. We want to run more events like this. So if you want to know, we'd really like to know if we're getting it right and what we can do better in the future. And again, it just remains me to say, thank you all very much for your time. And I hope you have a pleasant rest of the evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.